I went to art school at a period when there was an awful lot of emphasis on technology. It was just beginning to come on stream that people were farming work out to photo labs or video edit suites. And we were very much pushed in that direction. So I would spend my days at art school doing video editing or working with 8-track machines. It wasn't tactile. It wasn't very viscerally engaged with the traditional processes of art making. It was the beginning of the end for a lot of those processes. And what I realized was, when I got home, I wanted to actually do something physical, but I was a bit tired for drawing and I was a bit tired for certainly for painting. So I thought, actually, I quite want to sew. And that was, I can't tell you, this was pre-Tracy Emin's quilt works. It was, no one was doing it. No one, as I got secondhand a book of embroidery stitches, and I thought, okay, I'm going to just, like a Victorian lady, I'm going to sit and make samplers of an evening. I mean, now that's all quite, everyone would understand that's like something you do for your mental health or, you know, to sort of have some quiet personal time. But in those days, it just wasn't a thing at all. And I taught myself counted thread needlepoint, and I worked my way through this entire book with these samples of stitches. When I got married, I came here and I had time and space to think about what I might like to do. And that was about 3 or 4 years after graduation. I thought I might experiment again with the textile thing. I found myself hanging around the haberdashery department in John Lewis and kind of sort of touching the threads and the wools, you know, and sort of thinking, oh my goodness, you know, maybe it literally did begin from that tactility, but I was also drawing and painting. So I began to think, how can I put these things together? Strip it kind of the whole process back and think, could I actually sew on canvas? I didn't like, and this was key, I didn't like the softness of the textile work. I think there really is a difference if you've trained more in fine art than in textiles. People who work with textiles are inherently a soft structure is their foundational material. And I still wanted something that had the rigidity of a painting, could be hung on the wall as a painting with that sense of a frame that a painting has. So I began to experiment whether I could stitch in canvas. There's nothing complex about my paint surface, although the elaboration of color, these colors are not straight from the tube and they are built up in layers. So they do have a particular physical presence because of that. You take for granted that you can paint a straight line with a brush, which is not easy. These are not stenciled or masked. They're painted freehand. And then you take for granted that you can draw into the surface with these graphic stitched elements in a way that has an interesting conversation. There does come a point in every artwork where it's not conscious. You cannot quite pull out how you do it. I have some slightly odd ways in which I set myself up for work. I'm actually interested in seasonality. Now, no one talks very much about seasonality in relation to art, but say in Japanese culture, it's very important, for instance, that you display the scroll that relates to spring in your sort of display corner. And so there's a sense that your visual world should reflect what's going on. So I have a sensitivity to light and to a feeling of sort of, at the moment we're just in something I call wintpring, which is like late winter, a midwinter spring light. So I'm looking for the kind of colors, first of all, a kind of palette that will work with that particular light that I'm making the piece in. Now, in a weird sort of way, that almost relates to Impressionism, to a kind of color balance that that is to do with a particular temporal moment. It's bizarre about the question of finish, but I do spend quite a lot of time making sure that I don't overwork a piece. And the trick is to just stop almost when you think you're finished, take it off the frame. You can dismount it without actually fully dismounting it from this, and lay it down and have a really good look. Maybe take a day, sometimes just get a bit of time and distance on it. And then maybe it's just 1 or 2 strokes that need putting in, just 1 or 2 areas that need touching to finish. And it's much better to tread very, very lightly towards the end of the process, little tiny baby steps, just to bring it in. I cannot quite explain to you how the forms emerge. My basic vocabulary is geometric form, straight lines, things I can actually do fairly straight lines freehand, fairly good circles and curves freehand, but I tend to use drawing tools, but I use them with very soft pencils and charcoals so that there's a slight subversion of the hardness of the geometry, even in the underdrawing. And that creates a soft kind of order. I'm fascinated. To me, color is the subject. The forms on the surface are really just vehicles for those relationships. They just organize and control and contain and disperse and dispose and create an architecture of color. A lot of abstract artists have this taproot down into this idea of color being the subject and the pictorial surface simply being that way of organizing it. They tend to work very tightly. Bridget Riley's an obvious one, Joseph Alba's. It's, where everything's very hard-edged. I try to create a slightly softer edge. It photographs looking quite hard, but in fact, in reality, you see the colors slightly bump up against each other, distinctly having their own personalities. And then in addition, you have the stitch line done by hand, which is both a drawing back in sort of intervention. It's very improvisatory. It's very, it's never planned. I do nothing more than little thumbnails to sort of rough organization, rough feel. The language of geometry seems to me to be so, if like color, a basic ABC that's filled with the potential to make so many different poems, so many different stories, so many different moods, that I haven't got to the end of it, and I doubt I will. And then the stitch line, again, curves, straight angles, plumb lines and grids. What that does is draw back in, carve the space, create these sort of vectors of movement as well across it. It helps your eye move. But it also creates a three-dimensional surface, so that you have both a softening and a sort of articulation of the surface that adds, I think, an element of interest and has a very strong interaction with the color ground. Increasingly, I'm liking a sense of what I call handover from one piece to the next. So when I break the palette of threads that I've used, so in other words, I prepare to put them all back into storage, I always like to make sure that I'm using a few of the colors from the previous piece on the next piece, because that's like a nice hand over hand kind of rhythm, so that there's not too much of a departure and everything kind of has that family relationship. Because coherence has become increasingly important to me, in that I'm currently engaged in producing what I would call a body of work, rather than just experimenting and going off in tangential sort of experiment, sort of, inspirations, random inspirations. So that kind of continuity and follow through is really important at the moment. Where it comes from, I would say, is mood, sensation, visual memory, a strong connection with the world around me, but it also comes from an embodied place, a place of being in a body. I used to do a lot of dance, and I sometimes think that I'm almost like working like a choreographer, even more than a painter, and that these are my protagonists, the paint, the color, the lines, and I am choreographing your experience, of looking. So although it's what results is something very static and still and unchanging, it has actually come from a place of quite profound physicality as well. It's really interesting when you find yourself in a sort of quite restricted vocabulary. Like I said, I would find it difficult to move off of the geometry. It seems to work incredibly well, and I feel that it's still a rich resource. I would say that when I was younger, I was very interested in discordant color. One of my favorite fun things to do was to take a whole bunch of threads in my hand, just literally reach into one of my storage boxes, pull the colors out and think, whoa, that's a really nasty bunch of colors altogether. And then try to make a piece of work. I mean, literally it was that random. Try to make a piece of work that resolved those into, if not exactly a harmony, an interesting functioning organic relationship that had some kind of, it was compelling. So I gave myself, when I was younger, these particular challenges. And it was quite an abstract approach to color and quite experimental. And I sort of delighted in nasty combinations, ugly, beautiful combinations, or how you could put them together that was more than the sum of their ugliness. So that was quite, in terms of color, it's quite boundary pushing. Then I began to become more interested in a way, I suppose, getting more joy out of traditional paintings, going back to looking at, if you look very closely at, say, the color harmonies of quite a lot of artists, they are quite surprising. And I began to want to root the work in recalled experience. So I had an idea of making the colors seem slightly more harmonious. There were still unexpected elements. It's like that flavor in a dish that has to just sort of, just kick it to another level. So I still kept some of that, but I wanted also to see if I could take, not exactly what I call sort of wallpaper palette colors, not the Farrow and Ball, not the totally safe kind of range, but work within a slightly more contained, a slightly quieter register, and see if I could still sustain interest. And I began to look more for what I would call atmospheric effects based on recalled atmosphere of places or moments of being, moments of experience, and how to generate an atmosphere. And that's it. To be honest, it's more commercial because not everyone's up for some really zinging, nasty colors, and fair enough. but it's, in its way, it's a subtler kind of challenge. So now I've sort of quietened the palette down. I use a lot more tertiaries. Lots of colours are more knocked back. But I think it's still got, I hope, it's got a different kind of pictorial energy, a different, a slightly quieter, possibly slightly more confident statement. I don't feel the need to push the envelope. It's interesting, the sort of, when you're younger, maybe there's a different energy. And when you're older, you're actually more confident that you can make a piece of work that will be yours, that isn't necessarily envelope pushing. And it's a very interesting place to be that. And that's where I feel I am now, where I'm not afraid to do soft, perhaps rather cliched combinations, knowing that I will bring something to it that will distinguish it, that it won't be boring. I've got a friend who says, last thing we want it to look like is a necktie, or a scarf. So that's a fascinating challenge, but it does take confidence to say, actually, I can take all these very polite colors, but I can still make something that you will look at and know that it isn't just a piece of wall art, ghastly phrase, but it's very much in use. Something more than that. So I think I'm at that phase at the moment. But with the same methodology.